The Mughal Empire was founded by a Central Asian conqueror with a tiny army. Yet within a century, his dynasty ruled most of India, commanded enormous armies, dominated luxury trade, and presided over one of the world's richest economies. So how did a foreign dynasty become the center of India's greatest age of imperial power? And why did that same system eventually begin to break apart?
In 1526, northern India was not waiting for a Mughal empire. It was a political landscape divided among competing sultanates, regional kingdoms, Afghan nobles, Rajput rulers, and powerful local elites. Delhi remained important, but controlling Delhi did not automatically mean controlling India. Into this fragmented world came Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad Babur. Babur was a descendant of Timur on his father's side and, through his mother, claimed descent from Genghis Khan. He had spent much of his early life fighting for territory in Central Asia, losing and regaining cities, and eventually turning his attention toward the Indian subcontinent. His decisive opportunity came when Ibrahim Lodi, the ruler of the Delhi Sultanate, faced internal opposition. In 1526, Babur met Ibrahim's much larger army at Panipat. The numbers were not necessarily the advantage Babur needed. Technology and organization were. Babur used field artillery, firearms, disciplined formations, and a defensive arrangement designed to channel the enemy's attack. At Panipat, these methods helped his smaller force defeat Ibrahim's army. The victory gave Babur Delhi and Agra. But conquest was only the beginning. A battlefield victory could establish a dynasty. It could not by itself create an empire. Babur died in 1530, only 4 years after Panipat. His son Humayun inherited the throne, but not security. Afghan rivals pushed the Mughals out of India, and Humayun spent years in exile before eventually recovering Delhi in 1555. Then, in 1556, Humayun died. His heir was 13-year-old Akbar. And this is where the story changes. Because Akbar did not simply inherit an empire. He helped invent the political system that would make the Mughal Empire one of the most powerful states of the early modern world.
Akbar's reign began under enormous pressure. He had inherited a fragile kingdom surrounded by rivals. Yet over the next several decades, he transformed that kingdom into an imperial system stretching across much of northern and central India. Military conquest was part of the formula, but it was only one part. Akbar understood something that many conquerors learned too late. You cannot permanently rule a vast population through force alone. So, he combined military power with alliances, administrative reform, taxation, and political incorporation. One of his most important decisions was his relationship with the Rajputs. Rather than treating every powerful Hindu kingdom as an enemy that had to be destroyed, Akbar often pursued diplomacy and alliance. Rajput rulers could retain significant status, while their families and warriors became connected to the Mughal political order. This mattered enormously. The Mughal state was becoming less like a conquering army and more like a coalition of elites organized around the emperor. Akbar's mansabdari system became central to that structure. A mansab was a rank. Officials and commanders received positions that defined their status and military responsibilities. Their careers depended heavily upon imperial favor, while the state attempted to monitor the troops and horses they were responsible for maintaining. This created an important relationship. The emperor needed the nobles, but the nobles also needed the emperor. Their wealth, rank, and political future were tied to the imperial system. Then came the problem that determines the survival of almost every pre-modern empire. How do you pay for it? The answer was agriculture. The Mughal Empire was fundamentally agrarian. Its enormous military and administrative machine depended on extracting revenue from a huge rural economy. Akbar's government therefore invested heavily in measuring land, estimating production, monitoring prices, and standardizing assessments. Under the reforms associated with Raja Todarmal, the state developed increasingly systematic methods for calculating land revenue. The famous Dashala system used information gathered over multiple years to establish assessments in cash for different areas. This was not modern taxation, and it was not perfectly implemented. Local conditions varied enormously. Officials could abuse their authority, and the reality experienced by cultivators could differ substantially from the ideal described in imperial records. But the broader achievement was extraordinary. The Mughal state was trying to turn a vast and diverse agricultural landscape into a predictable fiscal base. That fiscal base financed soldiers. Soldiers protected territory. Territory produced more revenue. Revenue financed more soldiers. The result was a reinforcing imperial machine. And the machine kept expanding. Akbar conquered Gujarat, Bengal, Kashmir, parts of the Deccan, and numerous Rajput territories. By the end of his reign, the Mughal Empire was no longer simply a kingdom centered around Delhi and Agra. It was becoming an Indian superpower.
But describing Mughal success simply as military conquest misses the deeper story. The real innovation was institutional. The Mughal Empire was simultaneously centralized and decentralized. The emperor stood at the center. He appointed officials, controlled military rank, supervised revenue, issued orders, and maintained an enormous court. Yet much of the empire depended on intermediaries. Local landholders, zamindars, regional elites, village communities, merchants, military commanders, and provincial officials all played roles in transforming imperial commands into practical power. Historian John F. Richards emphasizes that even during Akbar's expansion, Mughal authority was far from complete. Local warrior lineages and regional elites remained powerful, meaning the empire had to combine force with negotiation and incorporation. This is one of the great paradoxes of Mughal rule. The empire looked highly centralized from the imperial court. On the ground, it was a negotiated political ecosystem. And that helps explain another remarkable feature of the Mughal state, its diversity. Mughal rulers were Muslim, but the empire ruled an overwhelmingly non-Muslim population. Akbar therefore pursued policies that, especially compared with some later rulers, emphasized political inclusion. His administration incorporated Muslims from different regions: Afghans, Persians, Central Asians, Indian Muslims, Rajputs, and other Hindu elites. This was not modern secularism. The Mughal Empire remained a monarchy with a distinct Islamic imperial identity. But Akbar understood that imperial legitimacy required cooperation across religious and cultural boundaries. He even created spaces for religious debate and developed an imperial ideology that attempted to place loyalty to the emperor above narrower political divisions. The objective was practical as much as philosophical. A diverse empire required a political language broad enough to hold that diversity together. Then there was the economy. Mughal India was not simply wealthy because emperors collected taxes. It was wealthy because it possessed productive agriculture, large urban markets, skilled artisans, sophisticated merchant networks, and enormous textile industries. Indian cotton and silk goods became highly desirable across international markets. European trading companies increasingly entered Indian commerce precisely because Indian goods were valuable. The English East India Company established factories on the Coromandel coast and at Surat, while Dutch and later French traders competed for access to Indian products. Indian textiles could travel thousands of miles. Cotton cloth from the subcontinent was sold throughout Asia, Africa, and Europe. The Mughal Empire, therefore, sat inside an increasingly interconnected commercial world. Its wealth was not isolated from globalization. It was one of the engines of early modern globalization.
So, was the Mughal Empire actually India's greatest age of power and wealth? The answer depends on what we mean by greatest. If we mean territorial scale and imperial centralization, the Mughal period was unquestionably extraordinary. At its height, especially under Aurangzeb, the empire controlled most of the Indian subcontinent. The Metropolitan Museum of Art notes that by Aurangzeb's reign, the empire covered nearly all of India, apart from the southernmost extremes. If we mean cultural production, the period was equally remarkable. Mughal architecture produced monuments that remain globally recognizable. The Taj Mahal was built under Shah Jahan. Imperial workshops produced manuscripts, paintings, textiles, jewelry, carpets, and luxury objects that combined Persian, Central Asian, and Indian traditions. But the phrase greatest age can become misleading if it suggests that everyone experienced the period as an age of prosperity. Imperial wealth was highly uneven. The court could display extraordinary luxury while rural communities faced taxation, drought, warfare, and local exploitation. The state depended upon agricultural surplus, and extracting that surplus could create enormous pressure. Cambridge scholarship emphasizes that Mughal control over rural society was incomplete, and that powerful local elites remained essential to the functioning of the countryside. So the Mughal achievement was not the creation of a uniformly prosperous society. It was the creation of a remarkably powerful political and economic system, capable of concentrating enormous resources at the imperial center. That distinction matters.
And eventually, the same system that created Mughal greatness exposed the empire to enormous risks. The first was succession. The Mughal Empire had no simple modern system of hereditary succession. When an emperor died, powerful princes and factions could compete for the throne. The resulting struggles could consume enormous resources. The second problem was military expansion. Aurangzeb, who became emperor in 1658, inherited an enormous empire and expanded it even further. But his long campaigns in the Deccan were extraordinarily demanding. The empire could conquer territory faster than it could efficiently integrate and finance it. The third problem was the relationship between military obligations and revenue assignments. Mansabdars and other officials depended upon jagirs, revenue assignments used to support their positions. As the empire expanded, the state had to continually balance the number of military officials it needed against the revenue available to support them. When the political system becomes larger, more expensive, and more competitive, the pressure increases. And then came regional resistance. Marathas in western India became a major military and political force. Sikhs developed growing political and military organization in the northwest. Jats and other regional groups challenged imperial authority. Meanwhile, the Mughal state still depended upon cooperation from local elites, whose interests did not always perfectly match those of the imperial court. This is why the Mughal decline should not be reduced to one villain. It was not simply because Aurangzeb was intolerant. It was not simply because of European interference. It was not simply because the empire became too large, and it certainly was not an overnight collapse. The process was structural. Military expenditure increased, political competition intensified, provincial elites gained autonomy, imperial authority weakened, regional states became stronger, and eventually European companies discovered that India's political fragmentation could be turned into an opportunity. Aurangzeb died in 1707. The empire survived him, but the political balance that had held it together became increasingly fragile. The Met records 1707 as the beginning of the Mughal Empire's disintegration.
The Mughal story matters today because it reveals something much bigger than the history of one dynasty. It shows how power actually works. Military technology can win a battle, but institutions determine whether a victory becomes a state. Tax systems create resources. Administrative systems convert resources into power. Political alliances reduce the cost of governing. Trade networks multiply wealth, and legitimacy determines whether people continue cooperating when the army is not standing in front of them. The Mughal experience also offers a warning about scale. The larger an empire becomes, the more efficient its institutions must become. Expansion can initially make a state richer. New provinces bring new taxes, soldiers, cities, trade routes, and resources. But expansion also creates new borders to defend, new elites to manage, new rebellions to suppress, and new administrative costs. At some point, growth can stop strengthening the system and begin weakening it. This pattern is not unique to the Mughals. It appears across imperial history. The Romans experienced it. The Ottomans experienced versions of it. European colonial empires eventually experienced it. And modern states face their own versions whenever political systems become too expensive, too complex, or too dependent on institutions that can no longer adapt. The Mughal Empire, therefore, gives us a useful historical laboratory. It demonstrates that wealth does not automatically create stability. Military power does not automatically create legitimacy, and territorial expansion does not automatically create lasting strength. Perhaps the most important lesson is that empires rarely collapse because they suddenly become weak. They often collapse because the system that once made them strong becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. The Mughal Empire began with conquest, but its greatest achievement was not conquering India. It was building a system capable of governing an extraordinarily diverse and wealthy civilization for generations. Its armies created territory. Its administrators turned territory into revenue. Its merchants connected India to global markets, and its emperors transformed political power into one of the most remarkable imperial cultures of the early modern world. But the same system carried its own limits. So when an empire reaches the height of its power, is that necessarily the moment it is strongest? Or can it also be the moment when its hidden weaknesses become hardest to see? If you want to understand how great empires rise, expand, and eventually fracture, explore the rest of the Great Empires and Powerful Nations series, and subscribe to Epoch Atlas for more documentaries that go beyond the familiar story.